Steve Coolius of the NHL Network on his podcast recently talked about players not wanting to be in Winnipeg. But is Winnipeg really that undesirable of a destination? Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just really love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, we have some fun stuff to talk about. There was recently a bit of a podcast piece from NHL Network, Steve Coolius on his show. The Power Play was talking about the Jets not being the most desirable location in Winnipeg, right? Why would players want to go there? And he said he sympathized with Shoveldayoff and the job that he has to do and the fact that Winnipeg is not a particularly attractive destination. And what I'll say about that is, I don't think he's necessarily wrong about the Jets having some unique geographical challenges. We have a team that, well, everyone jokes does not have a city with an airport, right? There's always a joke that you can't fly to Winnipeg. And having flown to Winnipeg, obviously, I know that that's false. But that joke is still kind of amusing in some ways. For some reason, the fact that it still persists is kind of amazing. But, there's always some stuff about Winnipeg and it being a small city and lots of crime. And listen, I hail from Baltimore. I've been to Winnipeg, for the playoffs. And when I, come from a city as well that has a really rough reputation, I live in Baltimore. So I know, I get it, right? We all come from like these working class cities with a rough reputation. I mean, for years, all people ever asked me about Baltimore was like, is it like The Wire? And look, it's not that The Wire wasn't based on reality, but it doesn't paint the full picture, right? These cities, Winnipeg, Baltimore, and many others like it, have vibrant cultures, wonderful people, and all that stuff. And it kind of makes you wonder, okay, so well, what of the players that want to leave, right? Who are the guys that don't want to stick around? And I want to talk about why most of the players who have actually wanted to leave, for the most part, we didn't really lose anything. We'll talk about that in just a quick moment. But before we go too much further, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, you'll notice that there's a bit of a question about tonight's episode being called The Price of Loyalty, at least on this first part. And I think in a lot of ways, most of the players that I would really want to be long-term Winnipeg Jets have generally stuck around. There's been one or two instances where Patrick Laine didn't stay, and we had some issues with Rutger McGroarty recently. But when you look at the sum total of who's actually walked and who has stuck around, for the most part, the players that I actually want the Jets to keep have indicated they want to stick around. Scheifele has locked in. Hellebuck's locked in. Niederreiter signed an extension. DeMello has locked up for his career for the foreseeable future with the Jets. Cole Perfetti is already training before he even has a contract in hand. And it seems like he's pretty much on the verge of either signing a bridge or some sort of deal with term. Ehlers is probably one of the rare exceptions where his status is a little more up in the air. I do wonder if a year under Arniel will change his thought process, but either way, for the most part, the guys that I want to stick around have stayed. Just recently, and what kind of got me thinking about this, aside from Steve Coolius' podcast, was also Danny Zhilkin actually posting from a car festival, which I thought was pretty fun. He said he was happy to be back in Winnipeg. Feels like a very pointed message, let me tell you, when a player who's a prospect and who's trying to fight for a roster spot tells you he's happy to be back in Winnipeg and is actually doing something that the locals really enjoy. That I think really tells you that sometimes there's actual players who really want to be here, and guys who are really interested in sticking around. I've always lived by the mantra of if you build it, they will come. And I think this Jets team wants to move towards a better, brighter future, and guys will be attracted to that. Winnipeg may not have the big city appeal of New York or some of these other fancy schmancy places, but look at Dubois, right? He went to LA and he was gone in a year. I still can't stop laughing about that, man. There's an even worse story. And look, it's not 100% confirmed, but it wouldn't surprise me. Rob Blake apparently got on the ice and suited up and tried to teach him how to battle, which let me tell you, if you are having your team's GM who's over 50 have to suit up and tell you how to play and do your job, that is, yeah, that's not great. Of the players who have left, who would be the best one? I guess you could probably point to Trouba, although I think when Trouba left, the reasoning was really about his family and his wife more than anything, so I totally respected that, and I thought that was fine. But as a player, he was actually declining, and pierre-luc in some ways is kind of just Trouba light, really. I mean, they're kind of the same level of impact now. So in a lot of ways, losing Jacob, while it was tough at the time, I don't think it really aged that terribly, because look how much he's being paid now and the sort of performances that you see with him. He has not really been all that good for the Rangers. You talk about Pierre-Luc Dubois. He got ousted out of LA within one season of signing a massive mega 8-year deal. He's gone. He's in Washington now. You look at Rutger McGroarty, and McGroarty, I think, is going to be a good player, but he's not going to be the kind of guy that's going to take the Penguins to a Stanley Cup final. He just isn't. I think that he's got really solid middle six potential, maybe on the higher end of that side, but nothing that the Jets, I think, couldn't live without. As much as I wanted him to be, this future captain for the Jets and really a big locker room presence, it seems like he didn't want to be here. And if that's the case, so be it. There are plenty of other guys who will fight for roster spots. There are plenty of players who want to be here. And you know what? Braden Yager seems like a really good stand-in as, actually getting a center, which is great. A natural center who seemingly is, excited to be a Jet. I don't know if he necessarily cares 100% where he plays immediately. I think Yager is one of those kids who's, he's a Canadian kid. He's played with Red Deer and is certainly looking to make his mark in the NHL, but perhaps some of the geographic stuff, as long as he gets a major role in the NHL, perhaps that's the most important part. Whereas McGroarty seemingly wanted to put the cart before the horse a little bit and get ahead of himself. And, while I don't disagree that he should have been given a chance to earn a roster spot, I don't love the way that he went about all of it. And I feel like the more that we've heard from him and from his camp, it just paints him in not the best light. So to Pittsburgh, I say good luck. But I say all of this to point out that a lot of the guys who have wanted to leave really haven't done that well elsewhere, or just aren't really worth getting upset about. The guys who have wanted to commit to this team and stick around long-term are the guys that I think have, A, deserved good contract extensions, and B, they're actually just some of our best players. Hellebuyck is a generational, once-in-a-lifetime goalie who's basically, in my mind, a lock for the Hall of Fame. You've got Scheifele, who's been your top center for years. You have many of your top defenders like Morrissey, who's become an elite defender, locking up long-term. And so the whole thing about the Jets struggling to recruit sometimes rings a little hollow for me. I think that there are enough players who want to stay. It's kind of about the Jets actually creating the right draft and develop model and actually using it. That's really the next step, right? And bringing more of a data focus, I think, is going to help with that. I think it's going to help with the margin signings. And all of that, to me, suggests that maybe, the whole reputation of the Jets not being a hot spot to go to is a little overblown. It's not something that I can dismiss because it's true. Winnipeg is not the most attractive city for young 20-somethings, but some of those guys just ain't really worth it. If they even stayed with the Jets, what would they realistically do for us? Be overpaid? Maybe not that great? I don't know. But I'm not going to lose sleep over it. I think we have a real good group of guys that are wanting to stick around and fight for it. And look, Brad Lambert could be at the very head of this pack very soon. Danny Zhilkin could be a guy who could be a contributor at the NHL level down the road. So all I'm saying is, the concern about people not wanting to be here, I choose not to focus on it. It's not something that I particularly care about anymore. I think I've moved past that phase. We were just 5 or 6 years ago on the verge of a Stanley Cup final with a team that, was comprised of guys who had been here since some of the Thrashers days, plus some new arrivals. If you get to, build that standard of quality again, I guarantee you players that maybe wouldn't have considered Winnipeg before will actually be banging on your door to join. So all that to say, I think Winnipeg is in a pretty okay spot. Now, I was talking about Rutger, and the other night I talked a little bit about some promotional nights, and I actually missed this one from the Jets. I think I saw it. It didn't quite register for me, but Rutger's making his return on October 20th, and the Jets actually listed that as like a special promo night for the month of October. They didn't quite call it a promotional night, but we all know what they're talking about. Let's talk about Rutger's return to the Jets and what to expect in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel. It's America's #1 sportsbook. It's a very safe, secure platform for getting in on all of the action. And for all of you NFL fans, this is probably one of the most exciting times the season has kicked off. There have been some crazy upsets. College football is just absolutely bonkers. I don't know if y'all watched the NIU game, but to see the emotion and the drama of that game had to have been something else, beating Notre Dame on their own soil. And if you had a bet on that game and you were betting on NIU to pull off the impossible, you are probably thrilled. But even if you didn't win that bet, guess what? You have a bit of an interesting offer, because for $5 now through September 22nd, if you bet then and if you bet now, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. With a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. So you can stay up to date with the latest, craziest NFL action and college football action. Of course, with the NFL stuff, you're going to get, some of your favorite out-of-market teams. I did see somebody comment that they're a Ravens fan from Rockville. Love you. Thanks so much for listening, and what a small world, huh? But if you are interested, be sure to visit FanDuel.com and download America's #1 sportsbook. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are talking about the price of loyalty, who wants to stick around, and did the Jets really lose anyone from the guys who have requested trades? I would actually argue for the most part, no. The Jets have actually gotten really good returns from most of these trades. I think that they have generally come out on the winning end. Just look at the Dubois trade, man. Velarde, Iafallo, Kupari, a second that became Alphonse Frey, who actually had been here as a kid when he played in a tournament in Winnipeg, which is so funny. All roads somehow lead back to Winnipeg, don't they? But amidst all of this, right, Rutger McGroarty just got shipped out for Braden Yager. And the Jets have actually put a bit of a small little asterisk next to the game against the Pittsburgh Penguins on October 20th. It'll be his first return to Winnipeg since the whole dramatic explosion, implosion, whatever you want to call it, broke out. And I think, for Jets fans, they're going to give him some healthy booze. I would imagine that if he suits up, it's going to be a fun night. I think, Winnipeg is one of those cities that kind of takes it a little bit personally when somebody, kind of disses us, right? I don't live in Winnipeg, but listen, I get it. I'm from Baltimore, as I said earlier. I know what it's like to live in a city that continually gets disrespected and gets crapped on by the rest of their respective country. I think Winnipeg maybe has it slightly easier because you guys don't have as much of a murder rap, and you also don't have a TV show, thankfully. We have multiple TV shows, if you can believe it, multiple documentaries, tons of media coverage. Oh Lord, that's all everyone ever sees about Baltimore, and it's sort of annoying at times. Thankfully, it's calmed down over the years, but at the end of the day, right? I think Winnipeg is always such a wonderful place. I've met some phenomenal people there. I've made some lifelong friends in the city. Thank you, Twitter, at the time for actually connecting me to all of these folks. But over the years, I've come to feel like it's weirdly a place that I'm somehow from, despite not being there. I think at some point I'd love to spend some more time in Winnipeg and come back up for some games and stuff. But at the end of the day, right, McGroarty's coming back, and I think the Jets fans are going to give him an absolute walloping of a welcome back. I think to some degree the Jets are going to be slightly more motivated to win that game. Typically, when the Pens come around, it's not that spicy of an affair. I mean, we've had close games over the years, but like the Penguins aren't really a rival. But this game, I think we're going to see a little bit more of an edge. I don't think anyone's going to like try and, kneecap McGroarty or anything. I think that they're going to play professionally and do the usual stuff. But I think that there's an extra incentive to welcome McGroarty back with a bit of a rude awakening. Now, usually when guys come back to play against the Jets, it hasn't always gone according to plan. Dubois' first return was a really rough game against the Jets. He and his whole companions kind of embarrassed Winnipeg in the first game, and then in the subsequent games, it was a little more imbalance of the Jets. But I think Winnipeg this year, they're just going to be a better team than the Penguins are. They're going to be, faster, younger, more skilled, and I hope that means that in the first game, the Jets rout the Penguins. McGroarty talked about wanting to go to a winning franchise, and he's going to probably taste the bitter sting of defeat pretty early here. I just couldn't imagine like telling somebody that you want to go to a winning team after the Jets made the playoffs the past couple of years, and then saying that you want to go to Pittsburgh. Like, okay, the Penguins many years ago were phenomenal, but these days they're lucky if they make the postseason. So what kind of culture are you looking for? What pattern of success do you really quantify as the one that makes you want to go to a specific team? Is it really about the record of success? Because by all merits, the Jets are the better team. So I always find it funny. I think he was just looking for an excuse to not sign with the Jets. That's my impression. And if that's the case, I'd honestly rather him just be honest about it. If somebody says, I don't want to play for the Jets, I don't want to sign here, that's fine. These kids, they don't get a choice when they get drafted. Their choice is to exercise their leverage and perhaps force a move. But like when they get drafted, it's not like they're choosing their own team. And so I totally understand why maybe they would not want to be a Jet. Do I disagree with it? Sure. Personally, as a Jets fan, I think, being drafted by an NHL franchise or a pro team in general is a tremendous honor, even if it's not in a place that I would traditionally look at to live in. But for me, I coming from, a city like Baltimore, I guess it just doesn't bother me. And like, I thought McGroarty coming from like Nebraska or whatever, I didn't think it would be an issue, but for some reason, I don't know what happened with that relationship. I don't really care anymore. All I know is when he comes in, I think the Jets are going to be extra motivated. And I would expect at this point, a couple weeks into Winnipeg's, early start to the season, you're going to start to see some of the lines gel a little bit. I'm personally excited for, a lot of the young kids and some of the new players the Jets have brought in from their prospect ranks. I think preseason heading into the regular season this year is going to be a very interesting time. I'm looking a little past the Young Stars Classic because I think the Classic is, it is what it is. We usually finish last in this tournament, and it's not that big of a deal for us. But preseason, I think this year is going to hold some particularly interesting battles for roster spots. I think there are a lot more guys fighting in the margins and looking for roles versus some of the established veterans. And I don't think Arniel has places locked down. So the team that takes the ice on October 20th could be very different than the one that would have been here had McGroarty stayed. I really do wonder if McGroarty realizes just the level of opportunity that he probably would have had if he had just committed to the Jets. The fact that he has sort of walked away from this franchise, I find kind of funny in some ways. I think he's gone to a worse team with, certainly, I mean, in terms of time on ice, he'll probably get it with the Penguins, but like, it's not like his skating was at the most elite level, and it's not like he's likely to be attached to Crosby's hip at the start. He's going to have to work his way up to that unless they really throw him in and he suddenly takes off and flies away with it. I just don't see that happening. So for me, I kind of feel like this is going to be one of those humbling experiences for him. I don't really wish him ill or anything. I don't subscribe to that sort of notion. I think a lot of people have kind of come to hate him, and I just don't. I think I'm a little annoyed by the way that he did things, but it all ended up in Winnipeg's favor anyways. So given the circumstances, I think the Jets did about as well as you could ask. They got Jagger in return. I think he's a pretty solid prospect. He probably has a relatively comparable ceiling to McGroarty, maybe just slightly lower, but perhaps a higher floor. I don't know. All I can say is at the end of the day, he didn't want to be here. he's going to have to live with that decision because I think the Penguins are not going to be good for the foreseeable future. And he probably, there's a real good chance that he's actually not sticking around Pittsburgh for terribly long if he doesn't hit the ground running immediately. So lots of fun stuff for the Jets, but all I'm looking forward to is October 20th being a huge Winnipeg Jets victory. But of course, I did sort of reference offhand the Young Stars Classic, and I thought I would give a couple of thoughts ahead of the first game towards the end of the week for the Jets. Obviously, again, like I said, this is not a tournament that you should pay loads of attention to if you're not really following too closely yet. For folks like me who kind of sometimes nerd out over prospects, or at least have had to do so a little more recently because the Jets have had to focus more on drafting, this is like a fun little teaser. It's a taste of Jets hockey to come, even if it's not like hockey that necessarily counts for anything. But ahead of the tournament, thought I would chat about some of the guys I've mentioned before, plus perhaps some names that maybe folks aren't thinking about as closely. But before we go too much further, just wanted to say thanks again for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day. While you're at it, I would also recommend that you make your second listen the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insight on every team in the league. It's available on YouTube or wherever you get your favorite podcasts, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are we're just kind of wrapping up a little bit with some thoughts ahead of the Young Stars Classic. Obviously, look, like I said, this is not a tournament that I particularly rate all that highly when it comes to prospect evaluation. It's just a fun little thing for the kids to get up to speed, to get excited about the season, and it's a little bit of a teaser for preseason and our regular season stuff. But for this tournament, I think obviously this is kind of exciting for the Jets for a couple of reasons. We're going to see a lot of young prospects that they've brought in recently for the first time. Obviously everyone's going to be watching Jagger to see what he's like. He's put up really good numbers for Red Deer, but I do wonder about his projectability at the pro levels. There have been some questions about how, highly his skills grade. I'm going to let him develop and sort of marinate. I think he's going to be a fun player, perhaps a middle sixer, maybe a second liner if we're really fortunate. The other guy that I'm really curious about is Marcus Lopode. We often have prospects that sort of sit in the margins of things who maybe don't pan out for one reason or another. Our Finnish forward category has kind of declined over the last several years. We don't really have a lot of Finns up front who have had great track records of success. I think back to Christian Vesalainen, who's doing okay in Finland, if I recall correctly, recently. Although I haven't looked too closely lately, just because I don't know. At this point, he technically does have some sort of a clause to return if he wanted to, but can't ever really see that happening at this rate. Lopone, he's a big, tall kid. He's got a solid shot. He's kind of rangy, but I don't know that he's necessarily the play driver that I'm hoping for, but maybe he is. Another guy that I'm kind of curious about is Connor Levis. Levis has sort of sat at my peripheral for a while now. The first time that I saw his footage, I was immediately impressed by his vision and his passing. That stuff is something that the Jets don't have a lot of. Elite distribution talent is not exactly easy to come by, despite the fact that everyone makes passes. But the way that Levis was able to pull stuff off in really tight spaces and find open players in areas where I think defenders would never even think to mark, for me, really impressed me. So I don't know how much it projects at the NHL level to be a high-end scoring role, but in a bottom six spot, I think he could be really interesting. It's just that he also has a lot of competition with established names like Gustafsson. He's going to have to outdo guys like Julian and Walton at some point. I think Julian and Walton are both two guys that I've really thought about for the future of Winnipeg's middle and bottom six. If one of them really takes the ball and runs with it, you might even be talking about a 2C somewhere in there. But that is the most generous, most fantasy dreamlike scenario. I think both of them probably top out around a third line center. But one of these guys could really take the buck and run with it, which would then have a spot potentially for Connor to maybe slide in somewhere in the bottom six, maybe as like your fourth line center. I think having the sort of type that the Jets have drafted with Walton and Julian is certainly not a bad one to have. It's tall, it's physical, but it's skilled and mobile. And I think that's where, the Jets used to draft only for size, but it seems like they've gotten smarter about, getting the bigger players, but guys who can actually move the puck efficiently and create offense. So that is exciting for me. Aside from that, the Jets have tons of like free agent signings that they're inviting for the defense, which I think is interesting. It feels like they've made that a priority this offseason to try and invite and bring in some more blue liners. Ben Slotty, Graham Sword, Dawson Barteau, and then Hunter Mayo are all coming in. I think one or two of those guys might end up making the Moose. Obviously, Dylan Anhorn has gotten a cup of coffee with the Moose already, and I would expect him to come back. But other than that, would any of these guys necessarily be NHLers? Probably not, is my guess. But hey, signing free prospects, letting them marinate, and seeing what shakes out is always nice. Every once in a while, you will actually hit a sleeper player who perhaps slides into a third pairing role. And if you get that off of a camp invite or even just like a tournament invite, you really cannot complain whatsoever. Free prospects are free prospects, and it is actually pretty hard to find NHL caliber defenders who are good puck movers and who can actually positively contribute. I think to the number of players the Jets have invited over the years and how few of them have actually made the NHL. So don't read too much into it, but just, keep it on the backseat, keep it in mind that maybe one of these players turns into something. If nothing else, the Moose are going to need more depth, and with all of the players the Jets are likely taking out from their most highest scoring roles, whether it's Heinola or Lambert or Chibrikov, it would be nice to give them some reinforcements to work with. And this Young Stars Classic might be more informative for them than it is for the Jets. So curious to see how they all do. Some of these guys are up front, on the forward side, perhaps maybe a year or two out from eligibility to make the pros. Maybe, the Jets are thinking about some sort of exception filing for somebody like Jagger. Doubtful, and I think it would probably require too many hoops to jump through. But, I mean, maybe if he really impresses, maybe they think about it. But my guess is he just goes back to junior. It's the easiest thing to do. I think it makes the most sense. And you let him do that for one more year, and then perhaps you bring him back for the Moose the following season. So all I can say is I look at this pool and I'm kind of intrigued by it. I think the Jets, like Will Scouch on his episode a while back, I think he put it nicely that Winnipeg has a good mixture of guys for where they were drafting. They may not have like the most elite tools, but there's a lot to work with here. And my feeling is that at least a couple of these guys are going to be NHLers in some form. Maybe not the most elite guys. Maybe they don't turn into players that are going to blow your mind. But you know what? If they just become pretty good players, that's all I care about. I don't need them to be elite. I'm not asking them to be just crazy high-end players. But guys who can contribute on a routine basis, if you get something out of those depth picks, you are laughing all the way to the bank. So let's hope that the Jets have a fun little Young Stars Classic. Would prefer to win more than one game or two if possible and not end up in last. But if it happens, it is what it is. But hopefully, this group of young guys is up for the challenge. But let me know what you're watching out for with this Classic. Are you going to be tuning in on October 20th as well for the Penguins game? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here this week for even more Jets coverage, so have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.